Good evening. Welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am Deputy Chief of the Pratt Library's State Library Resource Center here at the Central Branch. This evening, we are pleased to be in conversation with Rachel Swans and Lawrence Brown. But before I introduce our guests, we have many upcoming programs, and I'm sure all of you have gotten this wonderful, great Compass newsletter that's indigenous to Baltimore with the Oreos and the lemon stick. So if you don't have your copy, please grab your copy. We have some great programs coming up this summer, and if you haven't signed up for our summer reading program, we have our summer reading program that's going on where you could get a t-shirt and a free book, and it's for adults, teens, and children. So without further ado, Rachel Swanz is a journalist, author, and professor who writes about race and race relations as a contributing writer for the New York Times. Her articles about Georgetown University's roots in slavery touched off a national conversation about African American universities and their ties to this painful period of history. She has reported on immigration, presidential politics, and First Lady Michelle Obama, and her role in the Obama White House. She has reported from Russia, Cuba, Guatemala, and Southern Africa, where she served as a Times Johannesburg bureau chief. She has also served as a Metro columnist in New York City, and she is currently an associate professor of journalism at New York University. She also serves as an academic advisor to the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. She is the author of American Travesty, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama, co-author of Unseen Unpublished Black History from the New York Times Photo Archives, and her latest work, The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church, which is the topic this evening. Also, Lawrence T. Brown is an equity scientist and the director of the Black Butterfly Academy, a virtual racial equity education and consulting firm. From 2013 to 2019, he served as an assistant and associate professor at Morgan State University in the School of Community Health and Policy, where he launched the hashtag Be More Lead-Free initiative. He was honored by OSI Baltimore with the Bold Thinker Award for sparking critical discourse regarding Baltimore's racial segregation. And in 2020, he directed the U.S. COVID-19 Atlas Work and Response for the County Health Rankings and Roadmaps Program in partnership with the University of Chicago Center for Spatial Data Science. His first book, The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America, was published by Johns Hopkins Press. They will be in conversation this evening, so please join me in welcoming Rachel Swanz and Lawrence Brown to the Pratt Library.
All right, how's everyone doing? Thank you for coming out. Thank you, Rachel, for being here and joining us to talk about your work, The 272, which is, for someone who writes and thinks about race quite a lot, this was very educational and very disturbing for me. So we've handed out, everyone should have now, a handout with 272 names and the plantations in Maryland where folks were enslaved. I wonder if you want to start out by talking about, because I think that's what your book does, it really centers the people, the enslaved population, the enslaved community. So what are people looking at in their handout?
So what you're looking at is a map of the Jesuit missions in Maryland. And many people, well, that's the first thing. You've got your map and then you've got the names, and I'll talk a little bit about the names. I got started on this book because I was writing about a slave sale that benefited Georgetown. And the more I looked and the deeper I dug, I realized that the story about slavery benefiting Georgetown was actually a bigger story, a story about slavery fueling the growth of the early Catholic Church. And you can see here where some of the Jesuit plantations were located. And the next pages, and there are pages and pages and pages, this is a census that the Jesuits put together when they had decided that they were going to sell off the people that they owned. And to give you a sense of where and how I got started, and to give you a sense of what happened to the people listed on these pages, I want to start by telling a very short story. I'm a journalist, I'm not a historian, so a lot of what I try to do when I'm dealing with history is connect readers to the place and connect history to where we are now. So for this part of it, if you don't mind, I'll bring you back. And so if you were back in November of 1838, and you had been in Alexandria, Virginia, obviously not far from the nation's capital, on November of 1838, you would have seen them. Scores of people being loaded onto a ship, forcibly loaded. There were elderly people, there were husbands and wives, there were parents, babies. You would have seen the crush of the crowd. You would have seen parents clinging to their children, babies wailing. These were enslaved African Americans who were being sold from the people they loved and the world that they knew. And they had been owned, enslaved, and sold by some of the nation's most prominent Jesuit priests, who happened to be among the largest slaveholders in Maryland, with plantations in the places that you can see on your map here. And when they came upon tough times in the 1830s, they did what a lot of people did, which was to sell off their assets. And in this instance, the assets were 272 men, women, and children. They were trying to save their largest mission project at the time, the college we now know as Georgetown University, with the profits of this sale, and to build a network of other colleges up the northern seaboard. And they certainly were successful. Georgetown is one of our elite institutions, but it came at a terrible cost. And I wanted to write about the people who were sold and the people before them who built up the underpinnings of the church.
I just want to clarify for folks in the audience, the green and the red rectangles, those are the plantations. What you see in the purple, those two locations are places where St. Mary's Seminary and
Right.
Loyola College at the time, those are the institutions that were funded by, supported by
Right.
the Jesuit slaveholding.
Right.
So I just want to clarify that so folks understand.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about, just as an author, what was this experience like for you writing the book? You know, a lot of times that story doesn't get told.
So I can tell you how I happened upon this story. I got an email, actually, kind of randomly from a colleague at the Times who was a business reporter. And she had gotten an email from a Georgetown alum, a CEO of a tech company, who reached out to her and said, hey, you know, I want to give the Times an exclusive about a slave sale, you know, in 1838 that helped Georgetown. And she was kind of like intrigued, but also uncertain, like, was a slave sale a story for the New York Times? And so it really is my great fortune that she didn't delete the email and say, but she remembered that there was someone on the staff who she thought might know if it was a story. I had written a book about Michelle Obama and her enslaved ancestors, and so I had some experience with archival research, and she sent me the email, and I thought, oh my goodness, I knew immediately, because my first book was about how slavery shaped American families. And I saw this and I said, okay, this is the next thing for me, right? It's like looking at how slavery shaped a contemporary institution. And so I wrote this book, I wrote this story that appeared in the New York Times about this slave sale. And then I started writing a book. And really for a while, I thought it was a book about Georgetown. And it's a hard thing to do, because if you want to write about enslaved people, that's not easy. Writing about the 1800s, people rely on, letters, journals, diaries. And as you all probably know, by law and by practice, enslaved people were typically barred from learning to read and write. So those kinds of materials aren't there. And so I spent a lot of time trying to piece together, wanting to make this real for people, wanting to focus on one family, of trying to figure out, how I could bring this story to life. Who were the families that I could write the most about?
And so who were the main characters then in your book? Who do you really focus on? Tell us about that family.
So I decided, when people think about slavery, I'm aware that there's a whole range of folks who will say, no, thank you. Turn the page, not interested. So focusing on a family, making it real and human for people seemed to me like the way in. And so I ended up focusing on the Mahoney family. There are 272 people. There were scores of families. The Mahoney family, again, it's the records that kind of carried me through, but their family story kind of parallels the arc of the emergence of Catholicism first in the British colonies, and then in the early stages of the Republic. And so the story starts with a woman named Anne Joyce, who was an indentured servant who arrived, a Black woman who arrived in Maryland in the 1600s. And when her contract was finished, the typical way it worked, you worked your time and then you were able to live as a free person. Her contract was burned and she was forced into slavery. She did not have the power to do anything about that. But what she did have was her voice. And she told anyone who was around, who was available to listen, that her freedom had been stolen and that she should be free and that her children should be free. And that story, that family story, she passed on to her children, who passed them on to the grandchildren across generations. And the family always knew that. They fell into the hands of, her descendants ended up being owned by Jesuit priests. Many of the Catholic gentry would, bequeath the people, the human property that they owned to the church. And there's this long history of resistance. Some of her descendants resorted to violence. There were descendants who killed an overseer and were executed. Some went to the courts. They sued the Jesuits for their freedom, told the story that the ancestor Anne Joyce had told. Some of them were successful. Some of them were not. I tell the story of Harry Mahoney, who did not gain his freedom, who saved the wealth of the church during the War of 1812, and through that garnered from them a promise that he and his family would never be sold. And that promise was broken in 1838. And you'll see his name and his children's name in that list of names.
I think one of the things that's really difficult, like you said, about encountering, reading, thinking about slavery is just how gut-wrenching it is. I mean, for me, it often feels like a horror story, even though I know it's real. And so I'm wondering, I love the way you made the point very clear to me that slavery, one of the worst things about slavery was not so much death, but being separated from your family. And I wonder if you can talk about how the fear of being separated, sold down the river, as the saying might have gone. How did that play such a role before these families were sold in 1838?
So one of the fascinating things about the priests, and I should say that, this sale benefited Georgetown, but long before that, the very underpinnings of the church, the priests who relied on slavery and slave sales built not only Georgetown, but the first archdiocese here in Baltimore, the first cathedral here in Baltimore, some of the early convents here in Maryland, the priests who, opened the first seminary, St. Mary's, also ran a plantation and sold people. So there is that history. And, one of the things that that the priests would often say, because they had this thing where they, unlike us, some white people just considered Black people as brutes, as animals almost. The Catholic priests believed that they had souls that needed to be nurtured, and they felt that that was their responsibility. Yet they would nurture the soul and sell the body, and there were a few who had discomfort with that. So there was this idea that some, they often said, oh, because families were important in the Catholic Church, keeping families together was important. They talked about that being important. And so a lot of scholars would say, well, it wasn't until the 1838 sale that they really, tore people apart or sold them for profit. But that turns out not to be true. All throughout, from the 1700s, early 1800s, there are examples. Archbishop Carroll describes, coming up with some expenses that he had to deal with, and talks about maybe we can sell, quote, some unnecessary Negroes to make that happen. So this family that I'm talking about is living at a time when, one day your neighbors, your kinsmen, your cousins are, working, laughing, living as people do, and the next day they're gone. And that was what happened. And this was happening at a time when, slavery was expanding. So slave sales, by the 18 teens and on, it's not just someone who's going to be sold to the farmer down the road. It's someone who's going to be sold to Georgia, the Georgia men, someone who's going to be sold to the deep South in Louisiana or something. You would never ever, you would never see your people again. And what's interesting too is that the priests knew that this fear existed, and some of them protested and said, what are we doing here?
I mean, just for context, here in Baltimore at the Inner Harbor, 12,375 African Americans were sold at our harbor and shipped to New Orleans, Louisiana as cargo to support the slave trade or to support the economy of cotton growing and sugarcane, right? So this was an economic, I think that's another thing that you helped me to appreciate, like talk about the economic engine that this was for the Republic at the time, for the church at the time.
Yeah, so, literally, this is how the priests sustained themselves. It was how they, were able to build, as I mentioned, those institutions. And to give you a sense of how this played out, in the sale in 1838, I'll tell you about one of the characters in the book, a guy by the name of Thomas Malady, who was a priest, early president of Georgetown, very influential one. He expanded Georgetown. Also a leader of the Jesuit province, which was of Maryland, which was the first Jesuit province in the United States. And he was American born, and he grew up, his father owned people, so he had lived experience with slavery and slave ownership. And he was something of a visionary. He had a notion that actually the future was not this church rooted in this rural plantation economy. The church was, the future was the cities. You know, he was looking north. He was saying, you know, thousands of immigrants, Irish immigrants, German immigrants are pouring into the cities. He said, the future is not this, the future is that. And we need to be positioned to do that. We have this institution here. These immigrants will need schools. We need to be the ones to build those schools. How do we get the money to do that? And he pressed and pressed Rome to do that, saying, we need to sell these people, we need the money, I'm gonna build this, this is where we're going. And he was very explicit about what he intended to do and what this money would be used to build.
You know, for folks who are wondering, well, how do you know what those priests were saying? You know, how do you know?
It's a good question.
You know, what they were talking about. How do you know that?
So, and that would be a journalist question, first question. So one of the things, as I mentioned, this is very difficult research to do because of all the challenges I mentioned. But the Jesuits were actually very good record keepers. And so at Georgetown, a lot of the records still exist. You know, and so there are letters from the priests. He writes about it. He says exactly what he wants to do. There are letters from Rome. There are records about the plantations. You know, there are sacramental records and sacramental records in Louisiana too. And so with Milady, actually, you read he was a personality because it just crackles off the page. He's an intense person, and you can tell that he is. He was a very forceful, persuasive person. And in fact, he was right about where the future was. He was just willing to sacrifice a whole lot of people to get there.
So the priests weren't always in agreement. That's what you make clear in the book. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how they arrived at the notion of selling the 272 instead of emancipating the 272.
Yeah. So I think that's such an important point, which is that they were not always in agreement at all. And I think that's particularly important because sometimes when we talk about slavery now, people will say, oh, stop right there. Don't bring your judgments to the past. Slavery was legal, you know, so it was the times. You know, this idea of wrongness or morality, that's a contemporary notion. It certainly was not for the priests. There were people all along the way who raised questions and concerns about what was going on. And so in 1814, there was actually a plan to emancipate, to sell, you know, it's funny, when I say this, I hesitate because it's an odd thing to say, so I need to preface it by saying that enslaved people were considered assets, property. You could buy a person on an installment plan, you know. There are all kinds, you could get a mortgage and, you know, they could be used as collateral. So in 1814, what they decided to do was a method of selling and freeing people. They were going to sell people for a term of years, after which they were saying they would insist that the people would become free. It's unclear.
So that would have been a lease, right?
Well, it's unclear, you know, how serious they were about the emancipation idea. You know, Archbishop Carroll at the time was getting a lot of criticism about the Jesuit slaveholding. So there's some people who've speculated that maybe they announced this without intending to do it. It's unclear. But they did say they were going to do it, and they never did it. But there were, you know, around the time of the sale, for instance, there were priests another priest who is a figure in the book, a guy by the name of Father Joseph Carberry, was someone who later scholars, Jesuit scholars, looked back at and kind of ridiculed because he wasn't an intellectual. but he could see the humanity. He was kind of a mid-level manager in this kind of the Roman Catholic Corporation, right? He ran a plantation in St. Mary's County, St. Inigos, and he could see very clearly the humanity of the people who were there. He wrote about their skill. A guy who built a windmill by himself, about the faith and the religious devotion of the people. And he also saw that, one of the justifications for the sale, in addition to Milady's plans, was that they weren't financially viable. And he said, I think there's a mismanagement of Jesuit funds that's happening too, which he wasn't talking too much about. But, this guy, Joseph Carberry, said, I wonder if they could make some profit out of the land they were working, whether that would make a difference. And that's what he did. He had an experiment where he said, okay, you guys, these families, these acres are yours, you work them, let's share the profits. And so he could see ways of giving people autonomy. And when the slave traders came in 1838, he encouraged them to run. And some people did.
I thought it was fascinating to see how you gave, you were so balanced.
Well,
because you could talk about somehow.
I was going to say what happens with next. We'll talk about what happens. So Joseph Carberry encourages members of this Mahoney family to run. There are two sisters who end up getting split by the sale, Louisa and Anna. Louisa grabs her mom and they run. Anna has two young children and, she's taken away. And so I'm like, oh my goodness, Joseph Carberry. And awesome, right? So Louisa and her mother hide in the woods. They come back to the plantation where they are welcomed back into slavery and where they spend, the rest of their lives enslaved until
under Carberry?
Under Carberry until he dies, and then owned by Louisa is one of the last people owned by the Jesuits, in the 1860s when slavery's ended in Maryland. So it was this kind of crazy, I still remember thinking, wait, what? He encouraged them to run and welcome back to slavery? Like, how did that work? But there was some thinking that selling people was bad, but owning them, not so bad. Again, he may have also been, he was, as I said, kind of a mid-level manager. He didn't have the power to free people, really. They were owned by the order. But these kinds of contradictions came up a lot.
Right. I mean, the balance that I saw was that you didn't just say that all Jesuit priests, you didn't just like rant and rave, like all evil, all bad. You were sort of very careful, I think, to say, using the archival records to say, these are the ones that were pushing for the sale. And these are the ones, there were some plantation managers that had a softer view or a better view of African Americans.
Yeah, I think it's important.
I just think that range, that was very interesting how you laid that out.
I think it's important because I think that, again, this notion that everyone thought it was fine, it's important to understand that that just wasn't the case.
So let's talk a little bit about religion. And so obviously it's the church, it's the Catholic Church, my goodness, the church. That's it. I just want to make sure we appreciate that. But so how did the family, because many of them are still Catholics, right? That the ones that you're writing about, the descendants. Can you talk about their journey with finding out this information and many remaining a part of the Catholic tradition and faith?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Jesuits at times, required people to attend Mass or required people to participate in the sacraments. And it is, we don't really know. Like some people rejected, white man's religion. Some people embraced a kind of synthesis because the saints in the Catholic Church and, West African deities, there was a kind of way in which they could see some similarities. And some people did embrace the church, and how that kind of played out, we don't know. There were certainly instances where it was clear that if you didn't, there was punishment. There was an instance in the 1700s where a priest who found couples engaged in infidelity, we punished them by selling their children. So there were penalties, real penalties. On the other hand, it's clear that, some families embraced this. And, part of the work that I did, actually the most important part of the work that I do, is connecting this history with where we are now, with who we are now as Americans. So my great interest in, even from the first story, was about finding descendants and hearing from them, hearing their stories, hearing what they knew, sharing this information with them. And one of the really fascinating things was about how many of them remained Catholic. It's certainly true that after the Civil War, thousands of Black people left the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church also, after the war, was segregated, and a lot of people left. But members of this family and many of the descendants' family stayed. And I happen to be Black and Catholic, totally randomly. This is not how I came up to this work. But it was such an amazing thing. And in fact, the records, the sacramental records, ended up helping me and genealogists. There's a nonprofit whose whole body of work, the Georgetown Memory Project, has been trying to identify descendants. Sacramental records, because they stayed. They baptized their children, they got married in the church. They participated in the church. Even more than that, though, they became lay leaders and sometimes religious leaders in the church. And what they did after the Civil War was push the church to become more reflective of the people who they were supposed to serve. So there were 2 women in the family who became nuns and opened schools for Black children. They pushed for the creation of Black parishes in New Orleans. They worked in Sunday schools and in parochial schools, and they really pushed for a church that was more reflective. So there are people, and one side of the family I mentioned, 2 sisters, Anna, who ended up in Louisiana, Louisa, who stayed in Maryland. And that line of the family remained Catholic, remained deeply intertwined, working for the Jesuits up to the 1980s.
Mm. So you write this story in the New York Times. Many of the family members learn about this, and they begin to push Georgetown for some form of reparations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah.
And where that push stands today?
Yes. So as I mentioned, when we wrote this first story, I mentioned this Georgetown alum who hires these genealogists and says, wait a second, they didn't all die. There was some story about them all dying. They didn't all die. I want to find them. So by the time I wrote that first story, there were a handful of descendants. And we thought, and we all thought that there were more. So we published a link to the manifest, the passenger list for the ship that carried many people to Louisiana. And we asked people, we said, do you recognize these names? Are you from this town in Maringouin in Louisiana? Are you Black and Catholic from Southern Maryland? Do you know these families' names? Scores of people wrote to us, and we were able to help connect them. And they were also writing to Georgetown and to the Georgetown Memory Project. And they were learning about this history. Everybody, to a person, stunned. Some people knew more about the families than others, but this connection to the sale. And they got together, people cried, people raged, and then they organized. They started forming groups, they started pressing Georgetown, they started pressing the Jesuits. And Georgetown had, even before my story ran, had already started a working group where they were trying to think about, what do we do with this history? How do we address it? So that year, in 2016, Georgetown took a number of steps. It became the first university to offer what is in effect legacy status, preference in admissions to descendants, and laid out a series of things, some of which are just taking fruit now. They have a fund, they've committed to raising $400,000 a year that they are going to direct toward projects that benefit descendants. The first batch of projects have been funded for about $200,000. The Jesuits partnered with a group of descendants and announced in 2021 that they would create a foundation and that they would raise $100 million toward racial reconciliation projects and projects that would benefit descendants. It was the largest ever effort by the Roman Catholic Church to address its history in slaveholding, of slaveholding in the United States. And that's kind of where things are. And descendants have been, have had mixed feelings about, these efforts. With, some people feeling that it's not enough, we need to do more. And the Jesuit effort has moved a little more slowly than they had hoped in terms of fundraising. So a lot of this is still in process. And it is happening, of course, as we know, as, institutions, municipalities, the state of California, right, wrestling and grappling with this history and what we try, what can we do? What should we do?
I drive on Northern Parkway where St. Mary's Seminary is located. And it's a campus. It's a lot of green, bucolic, beautiful, grassy land. And I'm like, they need to give this land right here to the family. And let the family build housing. Loyola, I'm looking at Loyola. I drive past some of the athletic facilities. I'm like, okay, this is.
So it's interesting because Loyola is also in a process now, where they are,
right over here.
And there are some other institutions too. Holy Cross received financial support from the Jesuits. I'm sorry?
Canisius and
Oh, okay, so that's interesting. So Holy Cross, and I was about to say one more. What was I going to say?
University of St. Louis.
Yes, so they're the schools out west, and my book is focused on the Maryland province. There's one that went in and out of my brain, but yeah, it's not just Georgetown, it's not just Maryland.
Right. I mean, Georgetown has been approached, but it just seems like the Catholic Church itself and these institutions in Baltimore. And this is a profoundly Maryland
And I
story.
should say it is a profoundly Maryland story. The Archdiocese of Baltimore just recently announced that it was creating a commission to discuss and wrestle with its history and slavery. So I think it is, it's part of kind of what's going on, and it's certainly something that I didn't expect to see when I wrote that first story.
And are there any last thoughts you want to share before we begin to open up for Q&A?
I would just say that, I wrote that first story before, you guys may have heard about the 1619 Project. Before, there was, Ta-Nehisi Coates had written the case for reparations. But it wasn't something that we typically did in newspapers. And, at the time, it felt, even though it seemed like kind of a crazy idea, but it kind of felt like urgent to me as a journalist, like understanding the connections between slavery and contemporary institutions felt really urgent to me. And we're in a space right now where history is a battleground all around the country. And this kind of work, understanding these connections between slavery and the institutions around us feels even more urgent than it did when I started.
Absolutely. I'm encouraging everyone to buy a copy of the 272 and buy 2 copies and send one to Governor Ron DeSantis. Send one to-
We have time for about 15 minutes of your questions. If you could bring your questions to the mic here or mic here. We have a virtual component of the program so the folks back home can hear your question.
Thanks for this. I'm greatly looking forward to reading this. You may not know this, but if you do, I think when the enslaved were emancipated in various places, slaveholders were paid off, were
I do know.
compensated. And I wondered if you found any evidence that the Jesuits collected money not only for selling people, but also for having them freed, so to speak.
Right. So in DC, actually, it's a great source of records, actually. In DC, slaveholders did receive compensation. In Maryland, the reason why I know that the Jesuits owned the sister who stayed still, that she was one of the last people owned by the Jesuits, was that there was some hope in Maryland that there would be a compensation scheme similar to that. So people documented the names of the people who they owned and their ages, et cetera, in hopes that they would be compensated, but they were not.
This question might not be a part of your story since you're looking at enslavement in Maryland, but I believe that Baltimore had one of the largest free Black populations in the country. And what was the relationship between the church and that free Black population in Baltimore?
Right. No, that's an excellent question, and I don't really know the answer to that. I know that a number of, as I mentioned earlier, that there were a lot of connections between enslaved and free people. Often there was a kind of flurry, at least after the Revolution, of manumissions and these lawsuits, people buying their freedom. You had families where, one person or 2 people were free and other people weren't. Even on the plantations, I focused, the family ended up living on the St. Inigo's plantation in St. Mary's County. The priests, in addition to enslaving people, had free people who worked on the plantation too. And so I wish I knew the answer to that question. I know that they ministered to kind of, at least on these plantations, to the folks who were there, but I don't have an answer to your question in terms of, the free community in Baltimore.
So my question is more about, yourself, the author. So how do you hold or think about the level of responsibility in terms of telling this story and how it's connected to such a, prestigious school such as Georgetown? So did you receive any backlash, any barriers in publishing, specifically as a woman of color?
So, So there are actually, Georgetown, in dealing with its own history and in taking the steps that it did, had mixed reaction from people within the community, from alums who said, where are we going with this, and that kind of thing. For me, as a reporter and as a Black woman, as a reporter, getting information from institutions when you're writing about this, Georgetown actually, as I mentioned, had started on the process of trying to wrestle with its history. So they were, and I think as a Catholic university, there was a sense of feeling that there was a moral imperative to dealing with this, even though there wasn't that sense of moral imperative before, certainly in the period that I'm writing about. So they were, there are always challenges in dealing with institutions, but they were willing to grapple with it. But there have been other institutions where, people don't want to, I wrote about New York Life, for instance, and their ties to slavery. They have a corporate archive, which I felt very confident had records that would be helpful in illuminating this history, and they did not want to give me access. And I think as a journalist, you're always trying to push for more information than folks are willing to give you. I think as a woman of color and as a Black Catholic, it has been interesting at times doing this work because we often, you're doing the work again. Like I'm not in this book. The book is not about me. But some of these records that you're reading are, horrific, and almost in their ordinariness. I've gotten kind of a little bit used to reading the records that the lists, the estate records that list, the coffee table, the tablecloths, the furniture, the pigs, and the people, all in the same thing. Or, records where you see that, a family is divided up a person into percentages so that, this son owns, 1/6 of this person. And this person, families, a child who is sold by herself, it's most of the time, like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. My first book about Michelle Obama's family came out in 2012. So most of the time, I've been reading them for a long time, but there are times when, it's really, it's hard, I remember when I realized, November I had you guys at the wharf where this family, Anna and her children, and these others are being sold. And I remember realizing, oh, wait, there are waves of people being taken away that year. And I realized, oh no, their older brother was taken in June. And I just couldn't, I just sat with that. They knew this was coming. It's just, and again, as a journalist, I want to place myself there. So even just writing it, writing the section where they're coming, they're coming for them, and feeling like, wanting to call across the generations, across the, the centuries, saying, escape, run. It's a difficult thing, but I feel like it's really important work to do, and that we need to know.
Good evening, thank you. I have one very quick question. Did you find any connection to this sale in 1838 and the papal bull condemning slavery in 1839?
That's a really good question. So in 1839, let me back up. So I've been talking about, what's happening, in the British colonies and then in the United States. But of course, the Catholic Church is governed through Rome. And what's Rome doing? And the truth is that, slavery, and this was a justification that people use. So slavery is an ancient practice. It's mentioned in the Bible. St. Paul talks about the responsibility of slaves and masters. When Europeans come into the Americas, first go into Africa and come into the Americas, there is enslavement of indigenous people that is condemned by Rome. But the enslavement of Africans is not, and there is great silence. And the question is about 1839. In 1839, Rome finally issues a statement in layperson's terms saying that slave trading shouldn't happen. Some people have speculated about whether or not, there was some, that did the Jesuits get word? Did they know they needed to sell people before? But the truth is that that message did not change slaveholding among clergy in the United States. It was interpreted as, international transportation of people, not enslaving people, holding people captive. And in fact, there are bishops who argue publicly, no, that's not what the Pope meant. We can still do what we're doing, and he's not trying to say that we're doing anything wrong or that anyone here or that the Pope is against enslaving people. So it did not affect Catholic slaveholding.
We have time for 3 more questions, 2 over there and 1 over here.
So I actually do not have a question, but I really just wanted to, I'm a descendant of Louisa, and there are many of us here that are descendants, and I just really wanted to honor you and thank you so very much for bringing this history forward. Honestly, you don't know how much you've touched our lives. I mean, there's so many things that you have put into place because of this work. It's profound. I mean, it really is. And I just really want to thank you. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts. Our families are together right now over generations. We did not know one another before you wrote that story. And I'm going to just ask, and I just met another one just right now.
Yeah, if there are descendants here, could they stand, please? Could you stand?
We have descendants of Anna, and we have descendants of Louisa right in this room. And many others. And we also have some Loyola, the task force members here too. So, I mean, there's schools that are now involved. And again, I just thank you.
I think one of the things that, there are a lot of things that I never expected, when Richard Cellini reached out to the New York Times and said, I think the New York Times should write about this slave sale. I think that there's something here. And one of the things that I never imagined, I mentioned that when that first story ran, his nonprofit, the Independent Georgetown Memory Project, had identified a handful of people. There are now 6,000 people. Descendants who have been identified, probably more than that who don't know, right? And what is amazing is that this sale, it tore people apart, but they're finding each other, Families have been able to reconnect. Anna's descendants and Louisa's descendants now know each other. And so that's super meaningful. And honestly, it is a privilege for me to be able to do the work.
Hello. You had mentioned something earlier. I wanted to also piggyback on a difficulty of being also Catholic and Black. And I think for me, it's the history as well as currently with things that are happening in the church as well. So it's probably why I become more spiritual and pulled back. I still go to mass every now and then, but it's become quite difficult.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I would say, people ask about that a lot. You're Black and you're Catholic, and what do you do with that? What do you do with that? And I have to say that I was writing this book, as a practicing Catholic, as someone who was still going to mass and trying to make my kid go to mass. And I have to say that it affected me, but in ways that perhaps might be surprising to you. As I mentioned, this is a very difficult subject, heartbreaking. You could rage about it, but it's also a story of resistance. It's a story of love and family and faith. And these families who stayed in the church pressed the church to be true to itself, pressed the church to be true to its ideals of being a universal church. And then the descendants who are here went on to press the church and Georgetown in contemporary times to think about this past and to make amends. And I don't know, but that's inspiring to me. So in a lot of ways, it has deepened my connection to the church. And it has made me feel, it certainly transformed my connection, because I never had any idea. Enslaved people had been almost completely, left out of the origin story that's told about the Catholic Church. But I can see my story, even though it's not the same as everyone else's, but I can see my story and I'm inspired by what I've learned about the families.
Take our last question. Yeah, I also want to thank you. I come from Loyola as part of this task force stuff, and you've been very generous about sharing documentation, what you know. We've had this date on our books. We have a couple students who've been in the archives, and we actually stopped as soon as your book arrived yesterday. So we jumped in reading it, and we'll get back to the archives after that. So that's how important your work is to us. But I'm really curious what you would say about, and I'm not sure the correct term, about reparations or restitution. I'd love to hear your ideas about that.
So, it's interesting. Ta-Nehisi Coates, I was at a conference once, and he said, someone asked him about what reparations should look like. And he said, it's hard for me to get into a conversation about it should look like this or it should look like that, because I don't know that there's even consensus that there's a debt. And I would say, I don't feel as a journalist, I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a commentator. And I feel like what my role is to make the records plain, to tell the story, to bring stuff to light. And to me, I think the most important thing as a journalist, I'll say descendants, the institutions, the public at large are going to wrestle and grapple with what this will come out to be. But I think the most important thing is to look it in the face, to recognize it, to acknowledge it. And that's what is most important to me in terms of the work that I do.
Rachel Swarns and Lawrence Brown, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as Lawrence was dutifully doing, the book is for sale, of course. And Charm City Books, our book selling partners out there, please buy a book, buy two, buy three. There's other states you can send it to. Rachel will be back out there in about 5 minutes to sign your book. I saw a couple Black Butterfly books roaming around. Lawrence, you'd be willing to stay for a while and sign some books? Yes. I'm twisting your arm? Okay. Oh, great. Thanks again for coming out.